Welcome everyone to the NAB booth. Maxon's NAB booth here at NAB 2022. Sorry, mixed that up a little bit backwards. Mixing it up today. We got new folks, we got old folks, and we have our resident AI, our own meta-human, the living meta-human.
In the flesh.
In the flesh. Wait, in the virtual flesh. It's in the virtual. Virtual, right? Okay. So it's our virtual meta-human. From training, I've been trying to bring her across the pond for a long time, and she made it after all the craziness. We finally got her out. So from our own training team, Elly Wade.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, how's it going? It's so good to be here and see everyone in person. First NAB, first time in America as well. And yeah, I'm loving it. So I'm having a good time. It's been nice to have met a whole bunch of you over the last couple of days. It's been good. So yeah, as Matthias said, I'm kind of shortish on time, so I'm not going to give the whole spiel, but my name's Elly, and I work for the Maxon Training Team, and a lot of that is, doing live sessions, a lot of the stuff like this. We do a lot of them on YouTube, so we have demystifying post-production, we have Ask the Trainer, we have hands-on workshops, which are very near and dear to my heart, because I do them in Cinema 4D, and I do them in Redshift as well. And yeah, so today, the plan is to do a little bit of stuff in the new simulation that's come in S26. And then we're also going to take that, we're going to turn it into a MoGraph version of the simulation. And then we're going to take the data, and we're going to take it into Redshift, and we're going to basically just use color user data to make a really cool shader, and it's going to change all the different things, but it's going to be one material. So instead of me just talking about it, I'm actually going to show you guys what we're going to be doing. So this was a little animation I put together for this, just to kind of have a look at. So this is just the new rope dynamic simulation stuff that has come in S26, which came on Wednesday. So is anyone here in 26? Yeah? Nice, love it, cool. So if you're not, hopefully this will kind of, entice you to get into it. So let's have a look at the project file. Wrong way. Right, so so this is the project file that I created. And as you can see on the right-hand side in our objects manager, it's actually just 11 individual simulations, and each of those has a Redshift material on. And I thought, that's okay, that was fine, it worked for what I needed, but instead of doing it this way and having to kind of control each one and rotate each one to get this simulation or this animation, let's now build this same stuff, but make it use cloners, use fractures, MoGraph stuff, and effectors, and then take that information into Redshift and use color user data and create some cool looking stuff. So we're going to start off by just building our simulation. And so I'm going to come in, and we're going to build this all from scratch. And I'm getting used to this mouse already. Cool, let's grab a disk. And let me just make this a little bit nicer to look at. And so the easiest way and the quickest way to create a straight spline is to actually come into here, grab an end side, and then if we change our side to 2, we've got a nice little straight spline. So that is perfect. And I'm just going to change my radius, and the radius is effectively becoming our length now. And let me just make this a little bit smaller. And I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. Here we go. I'm just going to pull it up. So let me get in here. I'm getting used to this mouse. Right, what I'm going to do as well, for the sakes of this presentation, I'm going to change my display color of my spline to a bright yellow. So hopefully everyone can see it clearer than the sort of gray that it was before. So it's up here at the moment. And yeah, so now we can set up our dynamics simulation, and we can do that with a new spline dynamics, which is called rope dynamics. So for anyone who doesn't know, the way that we set up simulations inside of Cinema 4D is we use Cinema 4D tags. And the way that we access our tags is we just have to right-click on one of our objects, and then we get a whole variety of tags in here for different things. We've got materials, we've got rigging, we've got Redshift ones in there as well. And if we come pretty much down to the bottom, we have our simulation tags. And so we have cloth and we have rope. And these are the ones that have been converted now for the new approach. So we've got a new simulation approach, which what it does is it kind of divides our objects into particles. And that's why we're getting better performance, we're getting better collisions, and we're getting less intersections. And we just have so much more control and so much more functionality. And if you're used to the previous version of Cinema, and you're wondering, hey, where's rigid and soft body gone? Well, that's now up in our bullet tags. And so this is the kind of previous simulation system. So we still have that in there. Hopefully everything will come over soon, which would be lovely. So let's grab our rope tag. And let me just rename this stuff. And I don't normally do that. I'm like the least organized person ever. But for you guys, I'll do it. So we've got our rope tag on our, oh, I've spelled spline wrong. Never mind. So we've got our rope spline, and we've got our floor, and I just need to set a collider on my floor as well, because the trouble is, if I've just made my rope spline dynamic, but I didn't make my floor a collider, it's just going to go straight through it, and that's not really what we want. So I'm not going to change anything yet. I'm just going to play it, and we're going to see what happens. Okay, so hopefully we can see. Let me come a little bit closer in here. And actually, let me just make this a black material. This is also, we can see it better. This isn't like something that you would need to do. So if you play it through, okay, so it's dynamic, but it's not doing what I kind of want it to do. Like I want it to coil up like a piece of string or a piece of rope. And so what we need to do, we need to come into, let me just go back to the beginning. If I come into my rope spline, in my object, the trouble is my intermediate points are set to adaptive. So because it's a straight spline, Cinema 4D is going to adapt the number of points based on the curvature, but we have no curvature because it's straight. So we only have 2 points, and so what's happening is it's just kind of coming flat, and it's staying like that, and it's going to keep its shape, and it eventually would fall down. But I want it to kind of coil in on itself like a piece of rope or a piece of string would. And so all I need to do, there's actually 2 ways we could do this. We could change it to subdivided, and so it's going to subdivide our spline. Cool. But what I like to do is I like to do uniform, and the uniform is going to allow me to enter the number of subdivisions or the number of points for my spline. And so I have a little bit more control than if I just did subdivided. So let's go with 40 for now. We're going to increase this a bit later on, but for now, let's do this. Now as you press play, we can see it's actually doing, kind of what we hoped it would. It's starting to coil and come together and look a little bit more like a piece of string. So once we've got to this part, once we have our kind of simulation going, this is where we can come into our rope tag settings and start to really define it. And what I love about these new rope tag settings is the naming convention. It's like I've written it myself. Bendiness, stretchiness, cool. I'm not a very technical person. Anyone that's seen any of my stuff will know. No, I'm creative, artistic. I don't understand why things do the stuff they do. And I don't understand some of the words, but this is so perfect for me. I'm like, okay, cool. If I want it to be more bendy, I'm going to increase my bendiness. Wonderful. So to kind of see what each of these do, let me just kind of decrease my bendiness. And what it's going to do, so bendiness, so with the new approach, what it's doing, it's dividing our spline into individual particles. And so what bendiness is going to do, if I have not a lot of bendiness, which I don't, I've got 0.1, it's going to try and keep its structural shape. It's not going to allow any kind of bend and curling to happen. And so if I kind of play it now, you're going to see it's going to try and land and almost not bounce back, but it's going to try and keep its shape. So as you can see here, we're not allowing the particles or the points to kind of come in on themselves and coil together. So this is kind of the opposite of what I want. But I think it's a nice way of showing, what exactly bendiness does. So now I'm going to go to something like 30, which is a little bit of a, a bigger thing. And so we now have that. And so this is kind of getting a bit closer. And eventually we're going to subdivide it more, and then we'll turn it into geometry. But this is doing more along the lines of what I'm kind of hoping for. Stretchiness, what that's going to do? It's going to basically allow a stretch between each of our points or each of our particles that are making up our spline simulation. And so we can create some stretch. And we may not see it really now, but it's going to kind of increase its length, and it's going to, because our gravity is going to pull it down, and it's going to just look, it's going to look pretty cool. The next two, bounciness, friction, I'm not going to worry about going into everything. They're things that we're used to when we're working with Cinema 4D's dynamics. We're used to bounce, we're used to friction. But radius is super important here, and this is an amazing setting, especially when it comes to turning stuff into geometry. So if I just play this through, and we kind of get in here, hopefully you guys can see that everything isn't actually touching, and that's because we're telling Cinema 4D that each of these particles has a radius of 0.5. And so we're going to have a minimum distance of 0.5 between each of our points. And this is great. So if we turn this into geometry, we can now control our collision margin. And that's kind of the same type of thing from the previous system to this one. And then mass is great. So mass, if I had like a massive rock and a tiny pebble and I dropped them at the same time, the velocity or the speed at which they fall and how they bounce and how they land is all going to be different. So if I want to create a realistic simulation for a heavy object, all I have to do is increase my mass here. Okay, so let me just decrease this to 0.1 for now because I want some intersections to happen. Okay. I'm definitely getting used to this mouse. Okay, cool. So we have some intersections. That's cool. Like I wanted that to happen because then we can have a look at the new simulation settings inside of our project settings and start to fix some of this stuff. So if I press Command D, this is going to open up. For anyone who's used to Cinema 4D, you'll know that this is where we can access our simulation settings inside of here. The ones you'll recognize are the bullet simulation settings. So this is what we had previously, and these are the ones that remain for rigid and soft body. But the new ones are in our simulation settings. And so what's great is we can now run our sim on the CPU or the GPU. So depending on what kind of machine you have and what kind of capabilities, we can control that. We can control our gravity and our scene scale, similar things that we're used to. But substeps is where it's really important. And this is similar-ish to the steps per frame. What it's going to do, it's going to calculate the sim. We have 20 substeps, so it's going to calculate the sim 20 times per frame. And so what's happening here is that's not enough to be seeing all of our collisions. And so we can up this value. And what's nice is the performance is so good that I can kind of up it now. Let me come back up to here and play it through. And it's going to fix some of that stuff, but not everything. This is not going well. And then, so we can continue to up this, or we can continue to go down the settings and adjust different things. Iterations is how many times the substeps are going to occur. So we could up, if we're still having intersections like we do, we can up our iterations. And play this through again. And so we're getting a little bit closer. We're still getting some, but that's fine. That is expected. Smoothing iterations, whilst it's there, we can talk about. It's going to smooth out our animation, and this could help resolve some issues as well. So let me just put that on 1 and see what this does. So it's actually going to smooth out that animation, smooth out some of that jittering. And then, so we're still getting intersections, still getting some stuff, but it's great because we have so many more settings than we had in the previous simulation settings. So let me just maybe up my collision passes. So what's going to happen is it's going to calculate the collisions, and it's going to calculate the distance and the position of the particles at the start of each frame. And so now it's going to calculate it 3 times, and hopefully it should catch them. OK, so it's pretty much caught them. We've got a little straggler in there, but that's fine. That's cool. Because then we can do post-collision passes. And so this is going to calculate the collisions at the end of each frame. So let's see if this fixes it. OK, cool. So we've kind of got there. Like, I'm fine with that for now. And then dampening, what the dampening is going to do, if I add this like a high value, it's going to add a dampening value to each of our particles, and we can see it slowing down our simulation. And so this is quite like a high percentage, which is why it's really exaggerated, but it's nice to see how it works. And so this is cool, but I'm going to go reduce this down to like 15%. Cool, so we're getting closer to the kind of simulation that I'm after. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to come back into my rope spline, and I'm going to increase my number of points. And we're going to see this is going to really drastically change how this sim looks. So now this is more like the animation that I showed at the beginning. These were very similar to the settings that we used for that. So what we can do as well, one quick thing, if we just sort of come back to the beginning that we can show, and let me have a look at that. So we can actually anchor points. So for the sake of this, I'm just going to duplicate my spline, and then maybe make it like ZY or ZY, seeing as I'm in the States. And to anchor points, we have to have a spline that we have access to the points. So we have to make it editable, which is why I duplicated it, so I haven't broken my previous spline. And to make something editable, all we do is hit the C key, and then if we grab our points mode, we can grab like the start and the end point, and then we can come back to our rope tag, and we can actually fix these points. And once I've done that, and I press play, and come out of it, we then have 2 fixed points, but the rest of our spline is then dynamic, and it's just like a lot of fun. Cool, so let's just get rid of that for now. And let's come back to here. And now let's focus on what we've got time-wise. Okay, let's turn this into geometry and then make it like MoGraphable, and then we'll get into some cool Redshift stuff. So how do we turn this into geometry? All we need is to grab our sweep generator. If we drop our rope spline into our sweep, what the sweep needs is it needs like a second spline that's going to generate the shape of our geometry. And because I want to create a piece of string or a piece of rope, I just need to get a circle. So it's going to be nice and simple. So if I get a circle, let's make it small. This is going to be like the thickness. And then all we do is just drop that inside of here. And let's get a bit closer. And press play. Okay, so we have our geometry, we have our simulation. As you can see, it's still like super fast. But you're probably thinking, Elly, we're getting some weird intersections going on. I thought this was supposed to be a dynamic simulation. Well, the thing is, this is where the setting inside the rope tag is super important. So the radius here, we've told Cinema 4D that our simulation has a radius, and our collisions have a radius of 0.1. However, our geometry has a radius of 0.5. And so that's why we're getting, it's the geometry that's intersecting, whereas the spline dynamics isn't. And so we just need to match these values. So I'm going to do like 0.2, and then 0.2. And this was the stuff I ended up with in the final animation. I'll play this through. And now we can see we don't have any of those intersections happening, which is cool. And then we can make it look a bit nicer by shoving it into a subdivision surface, and then maybe just adding a little cap to here. And so now we have like the same rope spline that we have in our original scene. So in here, so these are exactly how these are created, the exact same setup. So let's come back again. So let me get a better view. Okay, so what if we now want to have a whole load of these? And what if we don't want to copy and paste, like I did, and change the rotation for each one? So if I sort of come back here, what I did was, as you can see, copied and pasted all of these individual simulations, repositioned them, rotated them, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit how many times I actually rotated some of them just to get the simulation that I was happy with, or the animation I was happy with. But this isn't ideal. This isn't like an ideal workflow because it's a little bit clunky. So let's do this same thing, but let's do it with like MoGraph. And so we're all probably thinking, all right, cool. We're going to get a cloner, drop our subdivision surface into our cloner, maybe reduce the size a little bit so everything's a little bit closer. And then we're going to press play. Oh, and then nothing happens. Why? Why is that happening? Well, the thing is, because we're doing spline dynamics, our cloner is actually cloning geometry, and so it's not able to calculate the two together. So we have to do it in a slightly different order. And what we have to do is we have to clone our spline dynamics first, and then we can turn it into geometry. So if we do this, and that's fine, we can just sort of adjust a little bit of rotation. Back in the cloner. OK. Get in there. I'm just going to pull this all the way up. OK. So now we're pre-thinking, oh, wait, it still doesn't work. So in this case, with this setup, our spline tag needs to be on our cloner. So because our cloner is now creating our 9 different rope splines. So now we need to tell the cloner that they all need to be controlled by our spline dynamics. So all we have to do, drop that on there, play this through. And now we have what we were kind of hoping for. And so at this point, let me get rid of my material, because we don't need that now. And let me just come back and grab that same rock. And this is actually from the asset browser. This same stone you can find in the asset browser. Just going to paste that in there. I'm going to hopefully paste that in there. Let's try that again. OK, cool. Don't need that. Don't want that. And don't want that. Cool, so we have our rock now. Just to make it look a little bit more interesting than it hitting like our floor here. And what I need to do, I need to also make sure this is a collider object. And now as we press play, our sim is going to collide, and it looks OK. So let's turn this into some geometry now. So how do we turn all this into a geometry? Well, we pretty much do the same thing. We grab our sweep, drop our cloner into our sweep, grab our circle spline, make sure we match that radius again, 0.2. And hopefully you guys can see that we're actually only getting one of our rope splines being like swept and turned into geometry. And this is where, if you ever come across this kind of issue when you're using like the cloner and generators, more often than not, we can work around this by grabbing a wonderful thing called a connect, drop our connect into here, and then drop our cloner into our connect, and it's going to fix all these issues for us. Cool, so let me sort of come out. And we press play. And so this simulation is still super fast, which is great. Cool, so let me just play that all the way through. OK, so this is working well. Let me find a little better view. And then we just drop that into a subdivision surface and make it look a little bit nicer. So now we have a very similar setup to what we had before. Let me just add a little cap so we have some nice rounding. OK, so now we need to turn this into MoGraph geometry. So even though we're using a cloner, we're cloning splines. When we want to use color user data, or I don't know if anyone knows a workaround for this, I couldn't find one with this set up exactly like this. I couldn't seem to use color user data with the cloner because it's not creating geometry. And so a workaround that I found, but yeah, if anyone has one, please come find me afterwards and let me know, because I spent a lot of time with Darren trying to figure this out. And this was our solution. And it's not great, but it kind of works. So the fracture is basically going to turn all of this into MoGraph geometry. Then we can take the MoGraph data from the fracture as opposed to from the cloner. And let me just, what have we got on here? Let me just reduce that down, just so this is a bit faster for you guys to see. Now this is coming down. Cool. So now we have this looking like this. We can now get into some Redshift stuff. So we have our simulation set up. We've got MoGraph geometry because we've used our fracture. And now we can take that information, we can take the fracture data, and we can use it inside of a shader or inside of a material in Redshift. And it's going to be able to control which shader or which material is going to be on which rope or which piece of rope. So for anyone who is new to 26, what you might find is if you're used to using Redshift, you're probably looking at it thinking, where is my Redshift menu gone? Redshift everywhere? Yes, we do have it everywhere. All you have to do is come into your render settings, come up to your renderer, change it to Redshift, and then they've increased the integration. So now what you'll notice is we now have our lovely Redshift tab here. And all of our Cinema 4D tools, so our lights and our environments, that are normally the standard and the physical, standard Cinema 4D stuff, is now our Redshift stuff. So it's great, so we can come into here and find all of our lovely Redshift bits and bobs inside of Cinema 4D. It's really improved the integration with this new release. And now, because I've changed my renderer to Redshift, when I double-click a material, it's going to create a Redshift material, and this is going to be a Cinema 4D node material, and this is what we're going to be working in. But before we do that, let's open up our Redshift render view. So I like to work in the render view. If you see my stuff, you know I don't really use the viewport IPR. I like to just have the two windows, and that's just how I work. And so let's have a look at how not beautiful this looks. So let's just set up some simple lighting before we do our material. So I'm going to grab a dome light. Let's get a little bit closer. Too close. This mouse. I should be more used to it, shouldn't I, by now? It's been about 25 minutes. And then let me just come into, what do I need? I want to grab my HDR. And here, actually, let me just grab one out of the asset browser. So for anyone who doesn't know or doesn't use the asset browser, it's a really great tool to find textures, materials, HDRI images, and objects for you to use inside of your Cinema 4D scene. So if I just search the word HDR and come down a little bit, we have our .hdr images that we can then use in our dome lights. Let me just use this one. This is like my most overused HDR from the asset browser. And it's going to download kind of quick. Sweet, there we go. Cool, so we've got our lighting set up, just some simple lighting for this. I'll show you the setup at the end for the other one. It's got a different HDR and it's got a couple of different area lights as well, but we don't have time for that. I want to get more into the material creation because that's the fun bit. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to drop this onto my fracture. That's important. And everything's going to go this horrible gray color. So let me open up my Redshift material. And now what happens is it opens sort of like a intermediary material editor. And this is for Redshift. But what I want is I want the node editor. That's how I like to work. So I'm going to open up my node editor here. And this is the Cinema 4D node editor, and you can access and create your Redshift materials inside of here as opposed to the shader graph. And so I'm going to admit, I'm very used to the shader graph. That's how I learned Redshift, and that's how I often work. But over the last couple of weeks, I've really been diving into the node editor with the new integration that's happened with this new release. I thought I'd teach this one instead. So I'm just going to dock it just to make it easier for everyone to see everything that's going on. Okay, so here we go. Let's make some room. Okay, cool. So what we can do, because we made this MoGraph geometry, we can take the MoGraph data and we can now do some kind of fun things. So let's have a look at some of that stuff. So inside of Cinema 4D's node editor, if you hit the C key, it's going to open up a shortcut to your nodes. And all you have to do is type in the node that you want, just like you would in the shader graph. So color user data is the one that we need. We can drag and drop that in. And this is going to allow us to kind of take some data from a variety of different presets. So we have our MoGraph data, color and index ratio. We then have geometry ID and display color, and then we can do particle color as well if you want to. So just to sort of demo this, I'm going to grab my geometry ID color, and let's just connect this together. So I'm going to connect this to my Redshift material color. And what it's going to do, it's going to take each individual kind of piece of rope, and it's going to apply a random color to it. Also, what I've realized is I haven't done the best bit. Let me kind of pull this down. So the whole reason for using the cloner was to add some random rotation and variation, which I haven't done. So let's just come back to my cloner and get a little bit closer here. So on the original scene, I added some like random rotation to everything. So if we come to our cloner, benefits of working with the cloner, we can now use our effectors. And my favorite effector is the random effector. And let's just add a little bit of like random variation in here. And what this is going to do, when we then play our sim, it's just going to make it look a little bit cooler. So at the moment, as we can see in the render view, like it's not looking that great. They're all sort of just like coming down and like coiling together. But if we add some random position and rotation, they're going to sort of like intertwine with one another and just make it look a little bit more interesting. Let's add some stuff in here. So we can see now this looks a lot more similar to the original one. So now if we play this through, if we come back to here, play this through. I'm going to try and catch it. So it's a little bit slower because, you know, it's subdivided now as well. Let's just leave it like that. You know what? No, I'm not happy with that. Let me add some friction. Because everything's like slipping and sliding everywhere. So let's come back into here and let's just sort of decrease my subdivision surface just so it's going to play through nice and smooth. Okay, cool. And now just put it back on like 1. Okay, cool. So, right. Back to the nodes. Cool, yeah, so what this is doing is it is taking the individual geometry ID and it's going to assign a random color to it. That's cool, that's fine. And then we can grab ourselves a ramp. And what I love about Cinema 4D's nodes is if I highlight it over, it's just going to apply it where it should be, so I don't have to worry about plugging things in and out like I do in the shader graph. And then we can assign a series of colors. And so once that updates, we have some cool colors. And so this is cool, this is nice, this is fun. But the trouble with this is everything is still defined. Each material is still defined by one set of base material properties. So if I adjust the roughness in this material, it's going to be adjusting the roughness on all of our individual pieces of string or pieces of rope. But what if we want to have more control over our shaders and we want to create some more advanced shaders, but still use like this color user data? Well, we can do that. So if we just get rid of that for now, and let's get some room. So if I hit the C key again and grab something called a shader switch and pull that in, I'm just going to plug that into my output surface. And everything's going to go white, and that is fine. And if we look at the shader switch in like the bottom right down here, you'll see that we can now have 9 different shaders connected to the shader switch, and then we can use a shader selector to define which one is going to be shown. So let's just turn that off. I'm just going to create some basic materials for now, and then we're going to change them when we can. Cool, so let's just change some colors just so we can see what this is exactly doing. So we're going to plug that in there. Shader 0. And then grab another one. And let's just make this like yellow, just like some random colors here. And then a third one. It's going to be white. Shader 2. Cool. So I'm just going to work with 3 for now, but as you can see, we can go up to 9. Okay, so now as we've set up our shaders, we can come into our shader selector, sorry, and we can change this value, and it's going to change to the different shader that we've assigned. And you're probably thinking, okay, Elly, but you're manually changing them. So how can we now take our color user data and use that and those different color values to control the change of shaders? Well, we can do that. If we just sort of come into our color user data. What we need to do is we need to grab something called a change range. And what a change range is going to do, if I change this color user data, so it works with geometry ID, but I'm going to do it with the index ratio. So it's going to now apply like a grayscale value to each different index. And now we can take this color information and we can turn it into numerical data and numerical information, so 0, 1, 2, etc. And we can now have that control which shader is going to be on which individual piece of rope. And so let's see how exactly that would work. So I'm going to plug this into my change range, input. And our change range, we can see we have like range min and max of 0 to 1. Then we plug our change range into our shader switch. And so now what's happening is it's taking that color information, converting it into numerical data, and that data is now controlling our shader switch. Our shader switch needed a number value, so we needed to use the change range to create the number value. And you're probably thinking, okay, Elly, but we can only see 2 different colors here. Okay, even though we have 3 shaders set up. So all we need to do is come into our change range, and if we change so at the moment we've only got 0 to 1, so we've only got shaders 0 to 1. If I change this to 2, we now have all 3 of our shaders, and it would work the same if we added another shader as well. So the benefit of working this way is we now have full control of each individual material. So before, when we had like the random colors, all of that was plugged into the same base materials, the same base properties. But now what I can do, I can have any kind of materials, or any kind of like shaders that I want, and it's going to be defined now by this data information. So let's kind of like do something fun. Let's mess with these shaders a little bit. Cool, so let's come in here, and so we're going to change this pink one. And one of my favorite things to do is to blend materials using a material blender. So if I just highlight that over there. Now our pink has become our base color by default because we just plugged it over like the line. And then let's like duplicate this white. And our white is going to become our material color, so layer 1. And then what we can do with the material blender, it needs what I would call a mask, but it's a blend color. And so we can take a grayscale or a black and white texture or texture map, and it's going to then use those black and white values to blend and show the different colors. And so the best way to create one is to get a good old Maxon noise. So if I drop that in here, let's give myself a bit more room. And let's get a bit closer. So if I hit this solo button, it's going to show me how this Maxon noise is being kind of projected onto here. And now I can start to choose a different one. I think this is the one I'm after. Yeah, so SEMA is a really cool one. If I actually remap it to make it smaller, we have this like really, really funky pattern. Let's come in here and see what that looks like. And so now what we can do, we can take the Maxon noise, which is our black and white values, and use it as a mask between our different materials here. So I'll plug it into my blend color. We now have a pretty cool looking material that's only actually using like 2 colors and a Maxon noise. And so that's like our first material. That looks kind of cool. And we could even use this same noise to control like the roughness values. So now the areas that are pink, which are technically black on our Maxon noise, are going to have a roughness value of 0. So they're going to be super shiny and glossy, like we can see they are here. And everything that is then white is going to have a roughness value of 1, so is going to be, pretty rough. But what if we wanted it the other way around? So what if I wanted the white areas on this texture here to be the shiny areas, and vice versa? Then we can use good old ramp node, plug that into there, and then with a click of a button, it's going to invert those black and white colors of the Maxon noise, which is now going to invert those roughness values. So now everything that we can see as pink is going to have a roughness value of 1, so it's going to be rough, and everything that we see as white is going to have a roughness value of 0 and be glossy. Cool, so that's one of our textures, that's one of our materials. And let's have a little look at time-wise, we're good. So let's do something with this yellow one here. And so let's grab, what kind of normal maps do we have in here? Do we have a normal? Let's see if we have something like, what could look cool? So maybe we could do some like cobbles just to make it look interesting. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's just use a Maxon noise, because I love working with like procedural materials. It's so much easier to work with, especially when it comes to creating stuff like this, because we don't want to have to worry about using a triplanar because we get flickering. I don't really want to have to worry about having to like remap a texture. So let's just use a Maxon noise. And again, I'm just going to solo it just so I can see how it's mapping on here. And then what's going to be a nice looking one? I think it's going to be Foxo. Yeah, so this looks pretty cool. So now we can use this Maxon noise as a bump map. Let's get a bit closer to one of our yellow materials here so we can really see how it's working. And grab a bump map. And let's just connect everything together. So output straight into our input on our bump map, and that goes straight into our bump map. We already have that input here already. Let's see how this is working. Okay, so it's a little bit too big. So by default, it's got a height scale of 1, which is way, way too big. Let's make it like a 0.1 value. See how it looks. Oh, a little bit too small now. So a lot of what I like to do is Redshift materials are so fun to play with. Like, I like to just sit and I'll tweak everything, and I'll just spend like hours and hours creating and building all these different materials with a whole bunch of different settings. And I can use this same Maxon noise inside of my roughness as well. So we have sort of like some crazy roughness values going on based on this black and white Maxon noise. Okay, cool. So let's sort of come back out a little bit, see what we have going on so far. Okay, so before I wrap up, there's one final thing I want to do. I'm actually going to grab a fourth material. So let's come in. And I'm going to deliberately use a new feature or a new thing that came with Redshift on Wednesday, and that is the standard surface material. And if anyone's used to working in Arnold, this is the equivalent to the standard surface material they have in there. And it's a more industry standard way of working. And yeah, it's now been integrated into Redshift 3.5, which is so fun. It's so cool. We can now create like really nice diffuse, like sand and porous materials with the new diffuse models. So we have a Lambertian spheres, which is really, really nice. We can also create metal materials really, really easily and quickly. And so let's come a little bit in here. Connect that to our shader switch, which is going to be shader 3. And then we need to remember to come into our change range and change our new max to be now 3, because we now have 4 different materials going on. Cool, so we can see this little guy down here. And so again, if you want to change how this looks, you can drop a ramp inside of here and tweak the black and white values, and it's going to tweak how these textures are kind of mapped onto our simulation. Cool, so really quickly back into the standard material, so our standard surface. If we have a quick look down, it's settings that we're probably used to, but we have so much more control now of the stuff that we want to create. And so just to keep it simple, if we want to create a metal material, all I need to do is up my metalness value. Nice and simple. And then soon it should update. Hopefully, she says. Let me just do a little refresh. There we go. So that should update now. Sometimes this happens with a render view, especially when you have like a lot going on in a shader or in a scene. It just needs to kind of have a little think about it. Maybe it's because it's late in the day. Or maybe it's because I'm presenting live and it doesn't want to work. Let's try this. Here we go. There we go. Second time lucky. Cool. So now, as you can see, we have our metal material, and all we had to do was up our metalness value. And what I love about this, no more do we have to do like that edge color or anything. All we can do is we come into the color and we can define the color inside of the diffuse here. So we can do like a rose gold kind of material. Maybe something like this. And when it updates, it's not liking me today. Okay, cool, there we go. So all we have to do is then define the color inside of the color here instead of having to worry about tweaking all those other different metalness values that we're used to from inside of like a standard material, which like we have inside of here. So this is what the original sort of reflection and metalness settings were like. Cool. So yeah, I'm very aware that I should be wrapping up because I've been about 45 minutes. But yeah, so in kind of like, just to recap, we had a quick look at the spline and rope settings and set up our simulation inside of Cinema 4D S26. And then what we did, we turned that into MoGraph geometry by using the fracture. And then once we did that, we can then take that MoGraph data and that information, and we can use that data to drive our change in shaders inside of here. And yes, that was sort of what we ended up with if we sort of create this. So just again, a quick little reminder, this was the animation that I sort of ended up creating for this. Cool. Thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Elly, our resident AI metahuman. It's always appreciated. So we do have time for a quick question or two from our live audience, if we have it. If not, I'm going to go to the internet. You know, live gets, in person gets priority, but I'd be happy to. Is that Hannah Hathaway? No, that's not Anne Hathaway. You didn't get, no.
She never misses a conference.
Never misses anything. All right.
Always round here.
Well, this is a question from the Blender folks, because they want to know if shader switch node is like the material blender node? No. So shader switch node replaced the material blender node, or does that still exist?
No. So we actually use the two. So the material blender, what that does is we can define like our different materials. So in our case here, we had a base material, we had a second, so we had like a pink and we had a white. And then we use a blending mask to blend between them. So we use like a Maxon noise to create this like funky looking pink and white here.
Right.
Whereas what the shader switch is doing is we're plugging in all of our different materials in our shaders, and then we use a shader selector to choose between which of those shaders is going to be on our like objects. And so what we did,
based on some type of index?
Yeah, so what we did, so you could not do that, so like we could switch that off. If we just like switch that off, we could just choose, okay, we want it to be shader 0 or 1 or 2.
Oh, okay, so it's one shader with a lot in there based on the index value, then it would choose which one is going to be applied to which index.
Yeah. So yeah, we took the MoGraph index ratio data, which was color, into the change range because we need numerical values for the shader switch. And so the change range converts that color data into numerical numbers, and then it then chooses which based on the
which
index
number
ratio.
to where.
Yeah, so
There you go.
doesn't replace it. Both are very good, both very useful, and yeah, both used in this.
And
in
work
this
well
scene.
together, obviously.
They do work very well together.
If you do have more questions, Elly will be in the back as we close out
Yes.
today's show. But also, she has another presentation tomorrow. Do we have you tomorrow or Wednesday?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
tomorrow.
Me and Chad.
Yeah, and Chad. So, yeah, you get double trouble tomorrow, folks. So definitely tune in for that. Let's give her another big round of applause and stay tuned, interwebs.
Thanks,
We're going to
everyone.
have a master editor and educator coming up next, Jeff Greenberg. So definitely hold on tight, and we'll see you after this.